Oops.
Hello, folks. Welcome. All right. If you go full screen for me, it should be working fine. I can see your screen, Amarie.
Okay, great.
All right. All right. We're a couple of minutes into it, so I think we can get started. Usually, I wait a bit longer just for those people who join slightly later. Welcome, everybody. This is our monthly behavioral talk. For those of you that might not know me, I'm Thanos Vostanis. I am a lecturer at the Tizard Center at the University of Kent, and we have an MSc in Applied Behavior Analysis and Positive Behavior Support. So, as part of our work, we organize these talks with esteemed colleagues of ours from all over the globe, and they are most polite in sharing their good work and their research so that we can learn from them and we can have a think about how we can improve our practice. We, apart from the course that we offer, we also have a peer-reviewed journal. So if you have any research that you're interested in publishing, check out the TISAR Learning Disability Review. It is a journal that focuses on what we call intellectual disabilities worldwide, but in the UK we use the term learning disabilities. In terms of today's session, just keep an eye out for 3 keywords I will deliver during the session. Make a note of those, and I will add in the chat the link where it will take you to a form. That's where you're going to put your name, your credentials, your certification numbers, and whatnot, and those 3 keywords so that we can issue one complimentary CEU, or if you're a UKBA cert, an APD, I think we call them now. Anyway, the same premise for now. All right. I will put some links in the chat, so just monitor that. And Amarie, thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Carnett. We're very keen to hear about your work on assent, and I personally think it's particularly one of those topics that I find exciting because we don't always consider folks who have complex communication needs, and I think sometimes they tend to drop off the radar. So thank you for taking the time to present to us today. I will be in the background monitoring everything for you, so take it away, and I will only interrupt you to deliver the keywords. Thank you again.
All right. Yeah, thank you. That sounds great. So yeah, I'm Amarie Carnett, and I'll be talking with us about a paper that a colleague and I, Chris Tullis, published last year for, well, actually, I think it was this year. When was that? 2025. Yeah, we wrote it in 2024. It hit the press in 2025, and it's a topic we've been thinking about. He's one of my research collaborators in a lot of AAC work, and so we started having conversations as soon as we started to see discussion within the literature on this topic. And so a special issue came up, and we were asked to provide something for it. And Chris pitched this idea, and the journal was quite excited. And that's kind of where our thoughts came to fruition. And I would say this is very preliminary work, and as we discuss assent today, we'll kind of get into some of those nuances about where we are in the research and where we could go. I think there's quite a little bit more work to be done on this topic, so if that's of interest to you, then I'm glad you're here today. All right, so before we jump into that, I always just kind of give a little background of how did I even become somebody that does research in this space. So if my slides will progress, we'll get into that. There we go. So kia ora, I'm Amarie Carnett. I live in New Zealand. I'm not originally from New Zealand, but this is my home now. I was born in Texas, and I had a very roundabout journey into our field, if you will. I started out as a special educator. Well, before I was an educator, I have a degree in political science and human rights. So I was working in that space with refugees and asylum seekers. But then, as most people end up needing a job, I took a job in education because I was buying myself a little bit of time to figure out what I wanted to do moving forward. And I kind of knew I wanted to go to grad school, but there were several things I was interested in too. So took a job as a history and social studies teacher, and then naturally started working with kids with different types of disability. And I was an inclusion teacher, and that was kind of my entry into this space. And from there, I started working with some behavior analysts, and I kind of saw that um, very non-behavior analytically as magical because those were skill sets that I saw really effective in helping some of the learners that I was actually struggling to help as a teacher. I didn't think I was as well prepared as I would have hoped to have been. So that kind of spurred me back into grad school. And that's where I started studying behavior analysis. And then from there, I really got interested into research, and my advisor at the time, Russ Lang, he encouraged me to join the lab that he had started, and I started doing some research in that space. But a lot of the kids I was working with were candidates or already using AAC systems. And to date myself, back then, iPads had just come, or iPods had just come out. And there was a researcher in New Zealand that was starting to do a lot of work in that space. And so I applied to his doc program and luckily was accepted. And that was Jeff Sigafus, who's also a behavior analyst. So I came to New Zealand, started expanding on some of the research Jeff had been doing in the lab, and really got hooked into research that way because there were a lot of unanswered questions, and a lot of the learners that I was supporting, we didn't really have clear guidance on what to be doing. And so it was really trying to figure out, like, how do we teach effectively different types of AAC systems, and how do we teach more expansive repertoires within that space? Because AAC systems, just like any communication mode, is not necessarily a perfect system. Everything's got pros and cons, and even vocal verbal behavior can lead to communication breakdowns for people. So that's kind of what got me in. And then from there, I kept working in academia, moved back to the States for a wee while, and then right before the pandemic was recruited back to New Zealand. And now I work at the University of Waikato, and I'm the director of the Behaviour Analysis program, and just working to try to expand the services in New Zealand and to ensure that we have quality assurance for the people that are providing those services. Similar to, I think, what's going on in the UK, which I think it's really exciting to see the field develop in this kind of way. So in terms of my research interest, I kind of hinted at this a little bit, but I really enjoy verbal behavior topics and verbal behavior topics within the context of people who have complex communication needs, who may not be engaging in vocal verbal responding, and kind of relatedly, functional skill building, because often within that population, it's not just that we need communication repertoires. We also need assistance with other important life skills, like toileting and sleep and things that can really impact our autonomy. So those kind of things go hand in hand in my mind. But for today, we'll kind of focus in on complex communication needs and people who may be candidates for using different types of alternative communication systems. And there's lots of different systems out there in the world. And some of them are good and some of them don't always fit the learner. And so making very thoughtful decisions in that direction, I think, are an important place to be started with. And I think assent kind of is something that we should always be thinking about in terms of when we're working with people where their repertoires might not look the same as everybody else, right? Or might not be understandable to every listener that they engage with. So I think we can think about these things as we help people develop programs and as we help progress development of skill. So that's kind of what brought us to this paper. So we'll kind of jump into it, and I'll just give us a little preview. I think y'all have had some discussion already on assent, so you may have some ideas about what is assent. So I just kind of keep things simple or parsimonious. Basically, when we're thinking about assent, it's just an expression of approval, right? I want to do this thing. And typically, this is conceptualized, I would say, by most people as some sort of vocal response. Um, And it can typically be waived with sufficient justification, especially when we think about like research and legality systems. Sometimes someone might be too young to really make an informed choice, or they may have not developed the necessary skills to indicate those things. So especially stateside, we can see things waived. In New Zealand, we do have like legal powers where somebody might have a legal proctor that make important legal decisions for their life. In research, we do try to provide consent and assent opportunities to everybody, but it gets messy because there's lots of nuances. Um, so there's a lot of number of prescribed activities that we've probably seen reported in the literature, like provided to us from the medical community, especially that's where we see the importance of making informed decisions about the medical care you're receiving. And so there's lots of actions or behaviors that we might want to evaluate to understand whether there's capacity to provide that type of approval. So with that, in clinical and applied applications, we might conceptualize this as the method in which a learner is going to provide that degree of agency or their input into an environment where they're a recipient of service. And so full assent means that we're not forcing any sort of involvement. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on because sometimes we might not understand the force that exists because there's power imbalances. And so this is where in our decision making, we've got to be thoughtful to make those considerations of, is there any sort of perceived force or even things that might not be as obvious. So really at the heart of all of this is self-determination, right? So we think about these things as behavior analysts in terms of our ethics, right? Our ethical responsibilities to provide good services to people. And so I think that's another area where we really have to think about things. Sometimes we zoom in on that micro level of analysis as behavior analysts, but I think equally it's important to zoom out a little bit and think, are we working towards autonomy? Are we working towards providing opportunities for self-determination? And I think assent kind of falls within this scope of practice. So there's been a lot of exciting publications, and we've had some clarity on definitions of assent, right? So we know that it could be a vocal response or even a non-vocal response for a client to help us see areas of willingness for participation or even continued participation, because it's not just that we would consider this at the start of service delivery, but it should be an ongoing process, right? And we might also think about it in terms of age parameters. And for when somebody's an adult, that would be consent, right? Assent is more related to people who are younger and can't provide consent because of the age restrictions in the law. So we also have to kind of think about these things. And with that, so we have to observe their willingness to participate in what we're doing, whether it's an intervention or a research activity. And so when it comes to people who might not be able to provide a vocal response, this is where we would need to rely on other behaviors that help us determine assent is occurring or not occurring. And within that, I always kind of consider some of the developmental literature as well as the medical literature because we do have to develop capacity. When we think about assent, it's actually a repertoire of skill, right? So there's lots of behaviors that are involved in assent. So for typical development, usually for children under the age of 6, we wouldn't say that developmentally that capacity has been reached yet, just in broad terms. By the age of, let's say, 6 to 9, and these are, developmental things, we kind of have some indication, but these things are individualized too. So age of 6 to 9, we might start to see some simple assent occur. That might be possible for somebody. Maybe they have some basic communication skills that they can engage in, and they understand some cause and effect, right? They understand the choices that they can make. But those things may be limited. We might to see kind of when kids start to hit the age of 9 to 13, we might start to see a little more increased understanding, especially related to like risks of their choices, like what's going to happen after I make this choice. So there's some reasonable agreement there within the medical communities. And 14 and plus is often where we would see more informed consent related behaviors start to form. And that's part of like having that full comprehension, if you will, like we've got good repertoires for thinking. um, so really the idea here is that we should be starting early to help develop those skills, right? Because our choices become more complicated as we get older, right? There's more variety in stimuli in the environments that we have access to, hopefully. So we want to start working in those simple spaces first. And as behavior analysts, that means we actually need to break down the skill sets involved and think about it early. And we do have some recent guidance from the literature and from our ethics code. So if you're a BCBA, you're probably familiar with ethics code 2.11 and 6.4, which give us guidance related to assent. If you're practicing in the UK, you're familiar with codes 6.2 and 6.3, which tell us that we need to prioritize client assent when a client is unable to provide consent due to their age or their capacity, and best interest decisions are made by their legal guardians and stakeholders. And so that's where social validity is a really important aspect of all of this. And then we would also think about this in terms of continuously monitoring. We should be data driven in this, right? We shouldn't just say, oh, cool, I ticked the box of assent, let's move on for forever. That's not how this works. This should be an ongoing process, and we should be looking for behaviors that indicate these things or providing opportunities for them periodically. Um, and finding the balance here, I think, is the challenge for us, because we could go all into the weeds on this, or we could keep it really simple. So I think we have to kind of think about what are we asking and what's meaningful in terms of providing an opportunity for assent. And then there's been some recent guidance in the literature, and this is not an exhausted list, but these are some of the important pieces of literature that I've read. So one in particular is by Cody Morris and colleagues, or actually two. So first he did a article, and I think this is where we started to really think as a field. This was one of the first things I saw come out on assent. Where we were kind of looking at like what are behavior analysts doing in this space. And then there was some additional guidance provided in 2023. And I suspect that was due to some misconceptions or overgeneralization from that first article. But that 2023 article was really nice because it provides us with 6 important considerations for thinking about assent. So one of those is determining the applicability and the feasibility of assent, right? We have to think about what is the repertoire of the person that we're supporting or providing services to, and what would be feasible for us to do inside of practice or inside of research as far as providing opportunities for assent. And then the next one is looking at those related skills. So just like we would provide analysis on or assessment on verbal behavior skills, we also want to think about, well, what are the behaviors that are relevant to assent for this person? And let's actually assess that. And then, of course, we want to arrange our conditions in which we might want to start teaching assent-related skills, especially if there's underdevelopment in that repertoire. And then, of course, this is an important one, and we'll touch on this later, but providing fair choices. Like, choices are not always equivalent, right? We all probably ran pairwise preference assessments in our practice. So we have to think about the stimuli that are involved and prior learning history related to those stimuli. And then, of course, selecting opportunities for assent assessment. It's not just that we provide the opportunity, but we also need to evaluate what happened and was it clear in terms of the behaviors that we observed. And that means sometimes we need to actually look at these things functionally. How are these behaviors actually functioning in life for that person? And of course, you might want to engage in some informal assessment of assent. And that's where stakeholders can be a very valuable aspect to us because they may see that learner in different environments. And so gathering information about what are the behaviors that might be involved, how does this person indicate? Those are important aspects of kind of doing the prep work and the groundwork for assent opportunities. And then there was some additional work that's been published that provides some practitioner suggestions around procedures that you could engage in behavioral programming. And this one's nice because it gives a little bit of exemplars on here's some things we could do in practice. And again, neither of these are exhausted lists of considerations or teaching procedures. These are just points of discussion for consideration. Everything we do needs to be individualized and based on the context in which we're providing services. And of course, because we're still, I think, what I would call an entry place, there's limitations to the research that's been done, especially limits to the guidance on specific learner characteristics.
Amarie,
So
can I
learners with,
deliver the
yeah,
first keyword?
please
Sorry
do.
to interrupt. Thank you. Guys, the first keyword is guidance, as the word that we had in the previous slide. The first keyword is guidance. Thank you.
All right, awesome. So as I mentioned, we've got limitations when it comes to learner characteristics, and learners with complex communication needs or people that are not engaging in vocal communication. It's going to look different across a lot of dimensions. So proficiency or use of AAC systems, the type of system, all of those things have to be under consideration. So we need further guidance, which is kind of where this paper came into play. We were trying to address some of these issues that might arise. So this may not be news to some of you, but we know that when people have greater support needs, there may be some limits or idiosyncratic forms of communication, and that's going to necessitate evaluation of how we might consider assent, how we might assess it, and how we document it. For example, a person with more intense characteristics related to like an intellectual disability, there may be some limits to that person being able to answer yes and no questions. I've worked with learners who say no to everything or yes to everything. And so there's not actual functional relation between those topographies of behavior. So we might have to look at other things, other behavioral indicators when it's not a reliable behavior. I've seen all sorts of interesting repertoires from some of my complex learners like this. So what might be kind of a seemingly small response for one person, if we can isolate that and test it, that might be something that could be measured consistently and have some indication of function of assent or dissent. And then also formal traditional methods for gaining an evaluation assent they may lend themselves to ableism in some ways because we're making presumptions about what somebody's communication repertoire should be, right? And when we're working with learners with CCN, we really need to be thinking about individualizing what is appropriate, what is feasible for that person, and that might look different, and that's okay. And there's really little agreement still on what actually constitutes assent. I think the medical profession and other practices are a little further along with like how they evaluate and what that looks like. So I think we still got work to do in that space, but I think we are working towards that. And I think when we are going to waiver assent, we need a good rationale for why that's being wavered for somebody. So is it because that skill set's underdeveloped? And if so, then that means that should signal to us that we need to do some support and programming to create more opportunities for that development to occur. So the idea here is not really straightforward and it's nuanced, and we really need to do a good job at operationally defining things and assessing them. So that's kind of where the aims of this paper come into play. It's to provide a preliminary framework. This is not like some sort of exhausted thing. It's got limits to it as well. But this is just to help us to start making considerations for this population, because our considerations may look a little bit different. And also to provide some future directions for ways we might try to validate and ensure that types of models fully represent and fully benefit the people that have greater support needs, so that there's good clinical guidance on our processes. All right, so in the paper, this is kind of what this looks like, but we'll break it down a little more systematically as we discuss. But again, I want to just recognize that there are developmental considerations for age of consent. Guardianship may also be something that's important to consider, especially as those things often are dictated by local laws. So whatever region you're in, you need to be aware of what the law is related to, like what are the powers of the guardian, what areas of decision making are they allowed to engage in versus your client. And especially I think in adult populations, this is where you've got to have some good understanding of the legal framework in which you're operating in. And of course, as all assent we know can be waived sometimes, but I would strongly encourage practitioners to still try to monitor assent related opportunities and related behaviors. That way we're minimizing potential harm and also emphasizing that person's human rights in that process. So prior to engaging in the second half of the decision-making model, there's some pre-assessments that should be completed, and those should be learner specific, of course. So I always like to start with risks because there's lots of risks in the world. I would say no environment does not have risk. Like there's risks everywhere. So we just need to be conscious of that. So when we're thinking about this, and we're thinking about, especially if we're going to waive consent or assent, we need to be thinking about the critical needs of the issue that we're supporting, right? So is this a health and safety need? And if so, then we actually need to make sure we're keeping people safe primarily. And assent may be something that is a later on kind of concern that we'll address. So this is where we need to think about what are we being referred this client for if we're at the referral stage, or what are the behaviors that we're trying to support for this person. And there's lots of risks analysis out there. So we're actually encouraged as behavior analysts to look at risks. So we want to look at, even I would say when you're working with like severe behaviors, there's still ways we can honor assent and provide opportunities for it. It just might not be in the context of keeping somebody safe sometimes. Unfortunately, we can't always get what we want in life, right? Like there are things that are non-negotiables. And I would say health and safety are generally those non-negotiable things. But there may be other behaviors unrelated to health and safety that are just important foundational skills for a repertoire that are also non-negotiable. I always think back to like my own learning history, right? So I have dyslexia, and when I was a little kid, if somebody had given me opportunities for assenting to research to reading group, I would have said absolutely not. I'm not doing that. But luckily, my parents said no, that's a non-negotiable. We need you to learn how to read. It's a pivotal skill for academic development, and thank God, because otherwise I wouldn't have the job I have today. So you know, sometimes I even think about like this related to social validity. Like, yeah, that person might not want to be involved at that moment, but hindsight is 2020. Like, I'm so glad I did that. I'm so glad I did the hard thing. So that's where I think when we are working with non-negotiables as behavior analysts, we can put things under that micro level of analysis. How do I make this situation a little bit better for you? How do I build in things that are reinforcing into that equation? And maybe it's just about like, how do I enrich the environment for you so that way it's got all the things you like in it, and that makes the hard thing not so hard. So this is where, you know, there's lots of considerations even when assent's off the table. So yeah, I would say for behavior analysts, let's use objective tools for risk assessment. So like the self-injury trauma scale by Iwata is a good one. If you're working with like self-injury or severe aggression, those are important things. In the paper, we provided a sample exemplar of questions that you might incorporate. And again, not exhaustive, just some things that might help you build up the types of questions you might think about when you're risk analyzing. So these things have to be tailored. There may be more specific questions related to the context in which you're practicing, especially if you're thinking about elevated health and safety risks or things that might cause collateral effects. So if you want to know more about risk assessments, feel free to reach out. These are some areas that I've been thinking about a little bit lately to help guide some of my students in their practice. So I've got some tools if you need them. So then this kind of brings us to the next bit, which is our pre-assessment. So we kind of want to start working on, well, let's look at the repertoire of the learner. And there's lots of tools we can use, especially when we're trying to think about communication repertoires. There's some really good verbal behavior assessments that are available in our field. So hopefully you're familiar with some of these tools like the VB map or the Essential for Living or even the ABLES assessment. And these things can be used across the age range, especially like Essential for Living is a really good one for working with adult clients. It's also got some really great decision-making guides that are embedded into it. But basically, utilizing these things can help us have more accuracy in what our definition is going to be and what the current repertoire or skill set of that person's communication looks like. And of course, because I think a lot about AAC users, this is just my laundry list, if you will, of important skill development for AAC users if we're going to get people towards independence and autonomy of use. So we want to be thinking about reinforcement control and MO. Those are especially important when we're starting out initially to teach things like manding or whether we're having the child engage in request or even like rejecting things, which I will also say is kind of an understudied area of the AAC literature. Most of what we've seen involves manding repertoires, and there's a lot to be done to build more robust repertoires for people, including teaching functional rejecting, like what happens when you don't want to do something or you don't want something. And there's a little bit of literature on that, but I think there's still more that we could be doing in that space. So I would encourage you look at the literature, especially to help guide like the progression of things. We also want to think about attending and scanning. I would say visual attending is a really important thing when we're talking about selection-based responding. You need to be able to look at the choice pictures and make a selection of those. And so that requires you to be able to look and scan. And so that might not be something in the current repertoire, and it might require specific programming to be taught. And especially when we're working with learners who have other conditions or other needs, right? If you've got limits to your visual capability, because maybe you've got another diagnosis, we would want to be conscious of those things. That way we ensure that the material we're using, the stimuli involved, and the procedures that we're using to teach are relevant to you. The other thing we want to think about is selection behavior, right? You actually need to be able to select out of an array or out of a grid display. And so that's going to require usually some simple discrimination abilities, right? We'd also want to think about conditional discrimination and correspondence. So when you select something, does that actually equate to the object, right? So there's ways you can test for this. The picture exchange communication procedures have that, and I think it's phase 3 where you engage in that correspondence and we test for it. But those things should be built into some of that initial learning. And then I would even say some related skills that are super helpful, especially if you're trying to expand repertoires to like functional tacting, which when you're a symbolic user, that's going to look differently, right? It's not actually what we might not say that's really tacting because it's truly just matching to sample. So matching to sample is an important related skill if you're trying to build up a functional tacting repertoire, as well as receptive identification. These are important developmental aspects of this. So these are just some things you might want to consider if you're working in that space. because these are kind of foundational skills to if we're going to do more advanced verbal behavior using an AAC system. And I would say assent should have some advanced verbal behavior, especially as we progress in our age. So these aren't just stagnant things. All right. And so the other thing we want to consider, so once we've kind of looked at pre-assessment and maybe perhaps we've seen some good foundational repertoire. So we've got communication that's established and we've got an AAC user, let's say. Then we would also want to look at choice making opportunities and choice repertoires. So does that person reliably make choices? Do they have experience in that? And this can be also quite idiosyncratic. I've had to do lots of different types of procedures for teaching choice making skills. I also have to look at different types of behavioral responses around that, especially with some of the young kids that I've supported who use AAC systems. Preference assessment can be tricky, right? And that's kind of what we're looking at when we do preference assessment is choice making. So I might need to arrange the environment in a real naturalistic way so I can just observe where engagement occurs and where disengagement occurs. And if I'm looking at more forced choice scenarios, then that's where I also want to make sure that that person is making choices across stimuli and that they're not just picking the thing that's on like in front of them. We want to check for like crossing the midline and things like that. So you want to assess for those behaviors. And I think you can do that in the context of preference assessment as like some initial places to evaluate choice making. So with that, within the literature, there's lots of different types of assessment for preference. Chris Tullis has published quite a bit on stimuli that function as reinforcers. So these are some things we could kind of look at to think about the procedures we might want to incorporate in our own practice. And then also components of interventions can be part of choice making. So with young learners, you might start with simple things, and then as learners progress in age and across the programming that's occurring, you could kind of look at some of those intervention components and provide choice making within that. So with that, these things might be characterized as like concurrent chains. So that's kind of what we would hope to build up towards. So is I provided you some different instructional arrangements and you've experienced them. And now we can look at whether or not you want to engage in this one versus this one. But again, these things require some exposure to know, to kind of teach what we're doing. That way informed choice can be made, right? And so I would check out Morris et al. For some guidance. And if you want a set of procedures, Hanley 2005 give an example of this in implementation. You could kind of look at that and think, how might I modify that into whatever relevant practice I'm doing with a person? And, you know, kind of making sure it also aligns to the programming that's needed. But not to put the handbrake on choice. I think choice is a beautiful thing, but there's limits to it, right? And one of the biggest limits is making choice is a skill set, right? So we actually sometimes need to teach that to learners. We can't just presume everybody knows how to make a choice. That's just not true. And we are also very limited by the availability of choices in an environment, right? So I see this a lot with adult clients is where I walked in somewhere and there's locks on cabinets. And that just, that environmental arrangement in and of itself limits the choices that are available to that person. So we also need to think about that. And you can't really make choice unless there's a history of reinforcement involved because it's not informed. There may be people that have been reinforced for making choices related to novel stimuli, but we can't presume that for everybody. I've worked with learners who, as soon as you put the new thing out, they're like, yep, let me take it and see what it is. And I've also worked with learners where if there's no prior exposure to that stimulus, they're not going to select it, right? Because it's unknown and there's no reinforcement history there. So they would get, when given a forced choice between something that they've engaged with prior versus something that's novel, they're going to pick the thing that has the reinforcement history to it. So we need to be aware of that because that's going to alter is it a choice? Because I would say in that situation, well, it's a forced choice, and that's not really a choice for that learner because they've never seen that thing and haven't had any sort of reinforcement history with it. And this is where you kind of think about choices of behavior. Choosing something should be observable and measured and thus analyzed. We need to be kind of looking at that. We have to think about past reinforcement in that regard, because there's constraints with choice, right? So that I'm a radical behaviorist in this, and so I always just think, is a choice actually a choice? And as Cody would tell us, Dr. Morris, are they fair? Because equivalence is kind of a thing we should also be thinking about, right? And so, not to get into the weeds of this, but we have to think about things in terms of the constraints that exist. So, our choices actually choices. Is choosing between the toy truck and the Legos actually meaningful, or are there constraints because you can't choose the race car and you'd really rather have the race car? So kind of we have to think about those things. And then the other thing we need to think about is coercion, right? And not that we're like running around providing coercion or aversive stimulus to people, but we do need to think about things get conditioned, right? So things can be aversive for some individuals. And so we actually need to kind of look at those things. Are we providing choices where there's like some degree of coercion within that choice? Because that wouldn't be a fair choice. Um, and then we also probably need to make some considerations around the matching law, but we're not going to get all into that today. But basically, we just need to remember that any organism, any person, we're going to allocate our behavior towards options that are proportional to rate or magnitude of reinforcement that's available for the options. So there's lots of experimental literature related to that, but it's just something to kind of think about. So just kind of bringing it back to, is it a choice and is it fair? I think those are some important questions we should be asking ourselves about choices that we provide. All right, and this brings us to the next thing. So once we've kind of considered choice making, we also want to think about behavioral indicators, because for people with complex communication needs, we might have to look at other sources of behavior, not just the use of the system, especially if they're still kind of an acquisition of the system they're using. So we might want to look at things like indices. Indices of happiness may be one area. We might also look at vocal indices. Sometimes we can look at these things functionally to see what's happening and is this a reliable way to evaluate choice making or assent opportunities. So
Amarie,
with that, yes,
can I just deliver the second keyword, folks?
yes,
For
please
the
do.
second keyword, you're gonna have a number. It's number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 5 is your second keyword. Thank you.
Excellent. So when we kind of think about just some initial behavioral indicators that we could look at, and remember, these things need to be individualized when we're talking about behavioral indicators, because I would say this is kind of where things can get real gray, and sometimes people ascribe meaning to them. And as behavior analysts, we need to be thinking about these things very functionally. So we might start to look at engagement versus disengagement. And that can tell us some things. And there's some guidance in the literature on the use of engagement versus disengagement. And especially for like very young learners, I'm working with a 3-year-old right now, and she's amazing because her disengagement behavior is pretty clear. She walks away and she picks up other stimulus in the environment. So it's pretty easy to observe that and to know that that means she doesn't want to do the activity we're engaging in any longer. So we kind of look at that in terms of reliability, and then I might pair some choice within that. So for individuals with CCN, of course, we need to kind of think about indications of assent and what that might look like in terms of alternative forms of behavior. So engagement with the task, that might give us some level of indication of willingness to participate in something. Whereas disengagement is kind of the opposite side of the coin, right? That might indicate a lack of willingness to participate further. Other behaviors like attention to a task might also tell us, like, are you attending to the task? Or is your head like looking at all the other things around that might be available options? so we want to provide some of those dimensions when we're thinking about assenting behaviors, because I kind of see these as, clusters of behaviors that we might want to observe and evaluate. And then within that, we might consider indices of happiness, or I would even say indices of contentment. So sometimes we see idiosyncratic behavior around what we might perceive as somebody being happy, right? Because happiness is kind of a construct, if you will. Those are internal states that, unless you've got a great tacting repertoire, they're really difficult to understand. So I kind of think about this in terms of, especially working with people that have complex developmental disabilities. I work with people that also have seizure disorders. And so neurofacial expressions might not be a good indicator for me to look at just on face value. Sometimes I actually need to see, like, when we have our most highly preferred item versus moderately preferred items, what are the different behavioral indicators I'm getting from this person that show they're engaging with the thing and they like it? Like, that might look very different for some people. So I would say proceed with caution on this, and let's not like overgeneralize behaviors across people, because it's going to look different across cultures even, but definitely within this population, it can look very different for people. So I would just say make sure you validate these things and you've got rigorous data collection processes for that. That way it's very individualized. And of course, this is where we get into those limitations again. Topographies of behavior can have different function, as we all know. So we need to be kind of thinking about less indirect and inferential data when we're trying to make evaluations about behavioral indicators, or we're trying to ascribe function to them. I would say don't ascribe function, actually test for function, because there can be ambiguity across behaviors. So I would say indices alone may not reveal controlling variables for assent-like behavior, so we do need to be cautious in that. I think it's a layer of behavior that could be added to it, but I don't think, if anything, when things are unclear like this, as a practitioner, it tells me, oh, we need to work on this repertoire so things are very clear and can be communicated across multiple listeners. And then we also need to be thinking about like functional assessment of these things. And I think if you got into like the VBFA literature, so looking at functional analysis of verbal behavior, that could be a really useful tool to evaluate functions of these types of indices. So looking at things on an individual level as well as a contextual level is really key features of our analysis here. Because we don't want to make risks of passive reinforcement, right, for participation, because participation that's a very broad set of behaviors. And so we want to make sure we're really targeting and pinpointing what behaviors are for that person and what's the function of that behavior. So there's challenges, I think, in getting reliability here. So that's where I would encourage some direct assessment of skills. And then across all of this, so this should be, again, embedded throughout, are these ideas of like being contextual and ensuring that we're providing valid cultural norms within the process. We may be working with a range of different people who come from a range of different environments and different cultures, and an assent may look very different across cultural groups. And so we kind of want to make those considerations throughout this process. So it really should be embedded in our considerations, right? Thinking about what are the norms and traditions of the people that we're supporting and their families and the stakeholders who are involved. I think that should be informative for every step of the way. Which means as behavior analysts, we actually need to take the time to develop our cultural humility around practice, right? And this kind of goes as an overarching theme, right? Like we want to be culturally safe, we want to be culturally responsive and have cultural humility. So we need to adopt lifelong learning to achieve that, right? I think we're going to constantly be learning. And I think if you engage in things on a level of cultural humility, that kind of promotes that lifelong learning that's needed. And it'll also help us to kind of hone in and self-reflect on, well, what skills do I have? What knowledge do I have? Where do I need to expand my own professional development to help ensure culturally safe practices? So we need time to collaborate, right? We need to be thinking about this across all the essential components, as well as all of the important people that should be involved. That way we're ensuring that there's accuracy in what we do, as well as relevance of what we do. And sorry, but you're not finished. There's lots to be done, right? This is a continual process. So this is not a checklist. It's not even really, I hate the word framework or model because I don't really think that's what this is. I really just think this is a meaningful tool that you could use to help brainstorm. It's limited, right? We haven't tested this, but I do think it helps provide some food for thought, if you will. So I would say this should be used to help identify important variables and to help I kind of think through the roadmap, so to speak, of your analytic decision making. But it's not exhaustive. So there may be additive features to this that need to be considered to help ensure that the practice you're engaging in is relevant to the client you're supporting. So I think the big takeaway here is that opportunities for assent and for learning assent behaviors, including assent withdrawal, they need to be ongoing, they need to be frequent, and we need to be embedding this throughout all stages of intervention and assessment, not just limited to the beginning of things or the start of a session. So for example, I used to work with this 19-year-old, and once he was familiar with like what we were up to, I would ask him, hey, do you want to come do research today? And he would often beat me to the door, which was a really good indication of assent. But throughout that, because there were other things happening across his schedule, especially on days where like we cooked, he really like he was such a fan, such a foodie, loved to do the cooking activity. And so I could tell on days where that was going to be in the afternoon, I needed to remind him when it's going to happen so that way he could engage in assent behaviors throughout our session. So, hey, do you want to keep going? Do you want to still work? Or do you want to go back to class and see what's happening? And so we would provide those opportunities for him to make assent-based choices related to the research activity, which not lovely for being consistent across how many sessions we ran every day, but for a researcher, it was us being flexible to those contingencies. So we just said, it's up to him how many sessions we run. We're going to run max this number, but we may only do 2 today. It depends on what's happening in the day for this person. So we just kind of looked at the averages. And what was funny was we kind of saw consistently on the days where there's cooking, we're only going to run 2 sessions. On the days that we're not cooking, he could go more than 3 because he was really enjoyed the activities we were providing. So these are some things we want to think about. And again, you want to create continual opportunities for that. So just to kind of give a little more discussion and some concluding statements here, it's important for us to think about decision making for people with CCN because this is really just the starting point of providing tailored and context specific and individualized services to people. And I also see research as service. So I say service in a real general way because a lot of the service I do is related to skill building. And at present, there is kind of limited data on how people have engaged in these types of processes. I think we are starting to see more reporting of assent procedures and research recently, which is encouraging. But again, I really caution on overgeneralizing that as here's what you do. There's no rule about here's what you do. Your client is who sets those rules. So I would say if you're going to engage in rule-governed behavior, let your client guide that. Let the person that you're working with help inform those procedures. So clinically, I think like organizations, practitioners, we should be pursuing assent embedded practice, right? When it's appropriate. Sometimes it's not appropriate because we need more skills to be able to truly make informed decisions. And that's okay, but we can work on those repertoires and we can move closer to value-based practice in the environments that we're working. That way things are continually evolving and they're objective. So I would say if you're going to take anything away from this talk today, It's that we actually need to engage in individualized evaluation and assessment of skill sets that help us to evaluate assenting behaviors for people with complex communication repertoires, including assent withdrawal. That way they can be involved in the decision making and have greater autonomy within their life. And yes, that's a big like concept, autonomy, but I think these are things that help build that. And then we also need to be looking at what are the related skills and where are things kind of lacking for that person in terms of skill development. And then from there, that's an indicator that we need to provide opportunities for learning, because that's really where our efforts should lie, as like life is continual learning, right? So it's not just, oh, you should have learned this a long time ago. No, if I'm working with a 50-year-old adult and I'm not saying this repertoire, then I need to start working on that with them. So I would not be an academic professor if I didn't leave you with some learning recommendations. And so I've done so across 3 different modalities that I think are kind of fun and might help you to think more about assent and related behaviors to assent. And one is just understanding behaviorism. So if you want to think about choice and what is really choice, I would say read the bomb text. This is one of them. Like this changed my life when I read it in my grad program. And it really made me think about like how to enrich environments to provide fair choices. So this is a really helpful text if you want to think about hard to think about topics. And then recently, this one just came out. I was really excited to see Cody on the Behavioral Observations podcast, and he was talking about some of his work on assent and some of the limitations to our work on assent. So I think have a look at that. Some of the discussion provided on people's overgeneralization of assent, I thought was really important and needed. And then lastly, this is just one of my all-time favorites. If you've not read this paper, I'm surprised how many people haven't read this paper. I would say this is a seminal piece of work. And it also has the best title ever. So balancing the rights to habituations, the right for personal liberties, the right for people with developmental disabilities to eat too many donuts and take naps. So when you think about choices, like how great are those choices, right? Everybody deserves to have some nice, fair choices in life. So that's where I'll leave you. Thank you so much for attending today. And I look forward to engaging in this topic more with our community and with other behavior analysts. And if you want to know more about some of the other work I've done, especially around AAC, check out my website, or you can look at some of the cool work that some of my students are up to. So, and there's my email. If you have any questions or want resources, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share with my community.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much. That's fantastic. And thank you for those recommendations and resources. Folks, the last keyword for your CEU is the color pink. You can just type pink in the form. The last keyword for the CEU is pink. I've got many people thanking you. Someone says donuts and naps is the best paper. Yeah, I completely agree. I'm afraid I have to shoot off, but thank you so much for the incredible talk. So knowledgeable and interesting. I felt also really well balanced and considerate of all the issues. Thank you ever so much. Any tips on how to shape up choosing new things? I think there is value in teaching people to try out new things, as this may offer an expansion of reinforcers. Any thoughts, Amarie?
Yeah, I think that's a great, like, it's something I think about a lot, right? It's like, I don't want to be too forceful in providing somebody exposure to a stimulus, right? I don't want to turn them off to that stimulus, but I do want people to have more choice available, right? And so I've worked with learners where it's really difficult to engage in even just trying out new things, right? So sometimes I need to take it back to the basics of stimulus pairing. What do you like and what can I pair with that? And I'm not forcing you to engage with that. It's just in the environment. So you've got some degree of exposure to it, right? And then over time, I might start shaping up the behavioral responses around that. Like before you engage with the thing you like, why don't you just pick that item up and see it? Cool. You can set it back down, get the item you like. Then we can kind of progress towards more functional engagement with that item or functional manipulation of that item if it's a toy, right? And from there, I can kind of build those things up slowly. I'm just shaping behavior very slowly. Um, but you do have to kind of balance that rejection of items with that. So, case example was just recently the little 3-year-old I've been working with. She, she hadn't really been exposed to a lot of toys, it seemed, or just didn't have a lot of interest. So I kind of did just some sampling with her to see like what might spark a little interest, what might she just attend to and engage with. And Bubbles was my way in. So I just started setting toys near her, and then I blow some bubbles around those toys. And now those toys are a little more interesting. We're going to pop those bubbles around the toys. And then one of the toys she decided to pick up. I'm not really sure what the feature of that toy was that she like looked at and kind of engaged in some response with, but we slowly shaped that up. It happened to be a little xylophone toy. So then I gave her the stick. I just handed her the stick. She set it down the first time. We blew some more bubbles. I handed her the stick again. She kind of held it, and then I took her hand because she's like kind of okay with that. And then I just showed her what it did. And then no demands past that, just like, hey, we're just going to sample it together. Now she likes it. She wants to engage in turn taking with me on that. So she's starting to try to do it herself, but sometimes she'll put her hand towards me as an indication of let's do it together is basically what she's kind of getting at. And so we do that. And I just we're working very slowly on building up some turn taking there and some mutual engagement. Like we're playing together is what I would say that is. And there's no force in that situation, but we're slowly building. That way, that child has more enriched choice. Because, yeah, I've worked with lots of people where the choices are simply limited, and some of that's just because we haven't had a lot of exposure in life yet.
All
So
right,
I would say,
I've got another
yeah.
comment here. We have been teaching a lot of our AHC users functional communication to stop when they're engaging in an activity they do not enjoy. Maybe we should also be teaching functional language to help say no before it begins. Although some pupils don't understand what the activity is until it's happening. Any thoughts on
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, so again, I think like to make a choice, an informed choice, you have to know what the thing is, right? You have to have some exposure or learning history around that. And there are things that may be quote unquote aversive to a child for whatever reason. I don't want to do that thing or I don't like it. And so that's where we have to balance those choices, right? Like, is this something that's a reasonable no for that child to engage in? I always kind of think about like I had a kid we were working with on like brushing their teeth. They hated it. Absolutely didn't want to do it. But the reality was we're starting to get cavities and that's not great because now we got to go in for some medical treatment on that. And for this child, medical treatment to like fill cavities meant we got to put you under anesthetic to like get it done because unfortunately we're going to see other behaviors occur that are potentially dangerous. So we started working on it slowly. And again, it was kind of more on that shaping procedure and embedding reinforcement into the environment to make that thing we have to do more enjoyable. So we utilized some music videos that child liked. Even when I was a kid, like, I don't know what the toothpaste is like in the UK, but in America, there was choice of toothpaste, like there was this blue toothpaste that had sparkles in it. And I remember my parents like providing me that choice of like to try to encourage me to brush my teeth myself. So we kind of embedded things like that. We let them pick the toothbrush that had the favorite cartoon character on it. We just kind of made things a little more like we provided choice where choice was available within the context of the must do skill. And then we just worked slowly, right? Like we increased approximations of brushing essentially. So the first one was just like get the toothbrush in your hand with the toothpaste on it and stick it in your mouth. And then we reinforced for that. And then mom would assist and brush, brush, brush real fast. Yes, we saw some like descent occur, if you will, but we did it really fast and then provided some rich reinforcement following the task that wasn't related to food because we don't want the counter therapeutic situation there. But yeah, you just kind of build up the tolerance. I mean, there are like issues related to tolerance training in our research, but I think that's where, as behavior analysts, we've got really great skill sets to be able to kind of look at well, what is the context in which this thing has to happen, and how do I enrich that context with reinforcement? And it may be that I'm providing external continuous reinforcement in some way, like we're watching a music video to kind of give us something we like, but also to distract us from the unpleasant thing that's occurring. And then from there, you know, we'll start to see tolerance behavior. So that child accepting the toothbrush and even starting to engage in independence around like using the toothbrush. And I think that's really the coolest thing because, you know, if you've ever had somebody brush your teeth for you, it's really, really awkward. They can't feel what you're feeling inside your mouth. I think, yeah, those are like must-haves in life. And sometimes we can kind of just make those things a little more valid and acceptable for people.
A colleague says, I have a learner we're working on trying new foods. After listening to this talk, I'm thinking of adding an AAC folder of new foods where he can maybe choose which one he wants to try. And so far, he has some preference towards fruits. This way, he can choose what fruit he wants to try. And we always have an all done kind of visual, I imagine, available as a code word for him. So I imagine this is so he will stop the program, if I understand correctly from Lily. This way he can show assent to try the food, choose what food he wants to try, as well as say he doesn't want to do it. And Lily's just saying thank you. I think you've given people a lot of good ideas, Amarie, with your presentation. Another colleague says, thank you, Amarie, very useful knowledge for my job with clients with CCN, both theoretically and practically, with good examples. Brilliant. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. I did as well. All right. I have posted the link to the CU form, so you guys now can add your keywords and your details. Please remember to click on the link before I conclude the session, because then you might lose access to the chat. I know that Teams sometimes does that. Amarie, thank you so much for the presentation. Guys, this will be on our YouTube, so if you want to revisit it, you can always rewatch it at a later time. And maybe Amarie will have you back again in the future to talk about some of your follow-up research that you do in this area.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody's time and engagement today. And yeah, I think, you know, we've got a lot of work to do, but there's lots that we already have great foundational skills to kind of, you know, work through the complexity here. So excited to see where we go.
All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very, very much, Amarie. We'll see you all around on the next one. Take care.
All right. Take care. See ya.